Once gay, always gay? The very sensitive topic of homosexuality is at the heart of this documentary. In particular, the belief that homosexual people are born and die that way, and that any attempt to change their orientation is useless and risks harming them. Is this correct? Is homosexuality fixed for good in those who feel same-sex attractions?
Hi. Today I invite you to dive into the world of therapies that help homosexual people to migrate towards heterosexuality. It is a taboo subject, explosive, and poison to the point where journalists, university professors, and elected officials lose their jobs for speaking about it favorably. In fact, Canadians walk on eggshells when it comes to homosexuality, noticing the disproportionate consequences apply to those who say out loud what everyone else thinks deep down. As a result, there is hardly anyone left who dares to publicly express an opinion on homosexual practices or therapies which questions the compulsory ideology imposed on the population, much like what happened in totalitarian countries. How did we get here? This documentary gives voice to a group of therapy specialists to answer this very question. No major media has deemed it relevant to give them a voice so far, which says a lot about the state of journalism in our country. The images you're about to see were rather taken as part of an independent investigation carried out over a period of 18 years, often recorded by amateur cameramen discreetly, in order to reach you before the gay lobby censors them.
I don't get the opportunity much to tell my own story. It may be more emotional for me today. I remember being about 15 years old, curled over my bed, sobbing and telling God that I was so bad, I did not know what to do. I felt very alone. And I didn't know that God was even hearing me. I felt very lost. The attractions that I had were so strong. They were obsessive for thinking about other boys in sexual ways. I could not stop the thoughts. It was obsessive all day. I would struggled with masturbation 5 or 6 times a day. I was doing that and fantasizing and feeling very lost, certain that I was not going to heaven. And I needed somebody to talk to.
Well, in my life, I didn't long to connect with the female world. I saw the female world as a liability because I grew up in a home where there was domestic violence perpetrated against my mother by my father. And so my dad was an abuser and my mother was a victim. So I identified femaleness or femininity with victimization and weakness. And I had an older brother and a younger sister, and so my older brother is the one I really looked up to. I didn't look up to my father as a role model because he was abusive. And so I looked up to my older brother, so there was a lot of gender confusion in my life.
I grew up in a home that was very fundamentalist. My dad used religion, in my perception, as a way of kind of manipulating. He would have been good in the military. He was very, very by the book. Very, very cold emotionally. I could not relate to him. He was interested in things I had no interest in. We sort of butted heads personality-wise. There was no connection. He was not terribly abusive. There were times where he did smack me a few times, and he would spank me in anger, which I suppose was not very healthy. But enough so that I was afraid of him. I was distanced from him. He was rather cold emotionally, and I could not connect.
I started to adopt very masculine traits early on, like even toddlerhood and certainly elementary school and on up. But it started very young, where people often mistook me for a boy in public. And so I was often called sir, son, and young man.
As I grew, those longings for a father figure just never went away. Constantly needing a father figure, a dad. I'd have one or two church leaders reach out to me, and I was just so starved for that. They would call, and I was just hanging on having them help me and work with me. But you know, they tried, but I don't know that they were always understood how deeply I needed some of that.
Tennis was the sport that I learned first and loved the most. And I would go into the locker room at the tennis club where my family had a membership, and this is as a young girl. And the women would say, "What are you doing in here?" And I would say, "I'm a girl." And they'd say, "Are you sure?" And I remember thinking, I only know one way to prove it. And so I just let it go. I just thought, I'm not doing that.
I tried out for the wrestling team in junior high, and I weighed in, I think, at 76 pounds. I was the smallest. I hadn't started puberty, really, and so I'm in there, and I don't know how much of you know about wrestling, any of you, but you know, they line you up in your boxer shorts, and they weigh you in, and I remember getting lined up to weigh in, and I'm the skinniest, I'm like a rail, and all these other boys that I perceived as being more muscular and had body hair, and so I was comparing myself. I felt different than them. I didn't compare to, I wasn't as good as they are. It was very, very difficult emotionally.
When we look at our clients, these are people, mostly men, who as little boys were shut down. They were hurt and rejected by male figures. They were typically in intimate but frustrating relationships with their mothers. And so they, because of their family dynamic, did not have the opportunity to internalize their masculinity. And they became what we call good little boys. Good little boy is don't offend anybody, don't get anybody angry with you, and there's a shutdown mode. Closed, self-protective, fearful, guarded, timid, shy. That's what they live in, okay? And the therapy is to bring them out, to be assertive, to be clear, to be courageous, to identify their feelings, to speak their feelings. My professional commitment is developing the most effective therapy to help men overcome their homosexuality.
I'll never forget at one moment being weighed in with the team, and I was like 2 ounces over my weight class. And the moment of awakening where the coach says, you know, your underwear is 2 ounces. So I'm at the front of the line, all these boys behind me, because it's lightest class to heaviest class. And so I'm asked to drop my boxer shorts and weigh in, and I was still a half an ounce over. So he had me go to the restroom to try and dump some weight and come back, and I was still like a quarter ounce over, and the humiliation I felt of feeling like I'm being paraded around, not as good as the other boys, was absolutely stifling to me.
As I got a little older, my parents were divorced when I was in 5th grade, and then my younger sister and I were sent away to live with relatives, and I was in 7th grade when we were sent off to live with my aunt and uncle and my cousins, and there I was sexually abused by an older male cousin.
There are actually 4 common reasons why people seek change-allowing therapy. Some identified as LGBT, they had LGBT experiences, but they, in the end, didn't find it fulfilling, so they want to change. Some people are married. There are many who are attracted to both sexes. They're married to a person of the opposite sex because they want to be, and they love their spouse and they love their children. They want to protect their marriage and their family and be able to go on being full-time moms and dads. So they want this therapy. Then there are some who feel that their sexual attraction was forced on them by childhood sexual abuse. They want trauma treatment that will also deal with the links between their trauma and their same-sex attraction behavior to relieve them of it. And they have a right to heal. And there are those who want to live according to their faith, and their wishes and their beliefs should be respected.
And so by 12 years old, I had only ever seen men treat women as the victim of their abuse or the object of their lust. My dad also had a addiction to pornography, and there was magazines, stacks of pornographic magazines in his bedroom. And so it was just a really dim view of what it means to be a woman. And so when I was sexually abused, one of the conclusions in that experience was, if this is what it means for a man to find me attractive, I don't want to be attractive. Because all they do is they take from you. Because they rob me of my dignity.
So it created a fear for me of being in the locker room, of doing sports. I tried church basketball. They'd put me in, and then we'd lose, and we'd get worse and worse. So they'd pull me out, put the other boys in, and then we'd gain the points back. So they'd put me back in. We'd start losing, so they'd pull me out. You know, that experience was just, I was tired of having those experiences. And then the rejection, the last one picked, was very tiring. So by high school, I was feeling very inadequate, feeling inferior. I didn't feel like I had buddies. I longed for a best friend, somebody I could tell my secrets to, talk to, a buddy that would walk with me in my faith, help me, be there for me. Never really attained that.
However minuscule amount of femininity I had up until that point, I wanted to even conceal even more out of a desire for self-protection. So even just hearing that much of my story, I hope you can see that absolutely it's not genetic. That there's some serious factors going on that's going to point me down a road. And I will say in my work in helping men and women walk free from homosexuality or from unwanted same-sex attractions, that in my work and with women, what I have seen, and this is true in my own life, is that lesbians are often trying to protect against further hurt from a man.
I was starved for touch. I was either getting a hit from my dad or nothing. My mother was affectionate with me, but I wanted it from my dad, from a man. I wanted buddies. I'd watch the boys at school hugging on each other, and it just created an ache inside me. I knew it was non-sexual, but I didn't know how to get it. I didn't have those kind of buddies that would provide that for me. I developed a lot of misperceptions about myself, feeling that these longings must mean I'm gay. The sexual feelings must mean I'm gay. A lot of misperceptions that made it worse.
John and Christine's analysis leads them to conclude that they were not born homosexual. Rather, they understand that specific events that occur during their childhood are the source of the same-sex attractions that emerge during their adolescence. They are turning to therapy not to cure their homosexuality, but to lessen the impact that these past events have on their present lives. Once the influence of these traumatic events dissipates with the help of a competent therapist, their same-sex attractions will also diminish and be replaced by attractions towards the opposite sex. This therapeutic process was explained to me for the first time by therapy specialists. Who are they? Basically, these are therapists who have developed protocols adapted to this clientele, who teach their colleagues, and who offer their help in their clinical practice. Then they are the researchers who have carried out scientific studies on these subjects in order to validate whether they have achieved their objective and if the therapies somehow harm them. Let me introduce you to the ones we will be featuring in this documentary.
First, there is Dr. Joseph Nicolosi, one of the 3 co-founders of the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality and its president for several years. Dr. Laura Haynes, psychologist, now retired, she reviews research and writes and speaks internationally on sexual orientation and gender identity. Dr. Nicholas Cummings, psychologist, was president of the American Psychological Association from 1979 to 1980. Dr. Stanton L. Jones is provost and professor of psychology at Wheaton College in Illinois. Dr. A. Dean Bird, psychologist, was a distinguished professor at the University of Utah School of Medicine. He was co-author of 2 studies on the effectiveness of therapies for exploring sexual fluidity. Dr. Julie Hamilton, psychologist and former president of NARTH, produced a video on the roots of homosexuality called Homosexuality 101. Dr. Christopher Rosick, former president of the Alliance, is director of research at Linker Center in California, as well as clinical faculty member of Fresno Pacific University. Dr. Carolyn Pila, former president of the Alliance, is a psychologist and director of the Behavioral and Social Sciences Department at Arizona Christian University. Dr. Joseph Berger is a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. Dr. Benjamin Kaufman, medical doctor, is one of the 3 founders of NARTH. Finally, Christopher Doll is a psychotherapist and director of the Institute for Healthy Families and the co-founder of the National Task Force for Therapy Equality.
So by the time I was in high school, my emotional needs for affection from a mentor, affirmation about my masculinity, it was all getting sexualized. It was so intense. My emotional preoccupation around jealousy. I felt jealous of the other boys. I was envious of them. I was filled with daydreams. What it would be like to have a best friend, and I'd hear the boys talking about what they did together in the campouts, and boy, I wanted to be doing what they were doing and didn't feel like I could. Or my better friends were girls. It was easier to relate to the girls. I could feel close to the girls. I had some guy friends, but I was closer to the girls.
We see this over and over again. These poor clients come in and think they have unique stories. They think it's unique because the culture is not talking about it. There's no way to get feedback. Am I the only one in the world? They come into our clinic and they discover, no, you're not the only one in the world. This is a typical pattern. And the mental health associations are doing not only an injustice, they are doing a violence because they are not letting this information be known.
I was very sensitive, and that made it more intense. My life experiences were intense. My sensitivity made things more intense for me.
Moving forward, I got involved in my first homosexual relationship when I was in high school, and I was like finally, feeling love and felt like, okay, this is who I am. And so I was settling into that. I mean, I know I was headed for, I would have made a wonderful gay activist had God not intervened, let me tell you, because I had enough anger in me.
So by the time I was 18, I was contemplating my choices. I remember my bishop, church I was going to at the time, was very concerned because I was talking to him about these choices of either running off, running away somewhere, or killing myself. It didn't seem like a very productive option there. I didn't really want to kill myself, but I didn't really see too many options. I didn't know how I'd live on my own. So finally, on my bishop's pushing, I told my parents.
I started out in high school, and I'm going to jump to several years later as a young adult in my last relationship with a married woman, which I'm not proud of that.
It was a horrifying experience. About had a panic attack on the side of the bed as I told my parents. My father's response was, "No, you're not. That's disgusting. Are you kidding? Do you know what boys do when they have those kind of feelings?" It was a terrible experience and pretty much shut me down. My mother just sat and sobbed, but she did want to help, and fortunately started to help me find some counselors.
With the support of his parents, John, who is 18 years old and able to make his own decisions, will meet a therapist for the first time. He will have the opportunity in therapy to confide to him the repeated lack of emotional connection with his father, from which he suffered since his childhood. Also, he will be able to discuss his poor self-image generated by the negative perception he has of his body, a perception fueled by traumatic moments in his youth. Is he wasting his time and money? If we rely on the opinions of the gay lobby, John has just made a completely insane decision. Why? Because he will never be able to change his sexual orientation, since at the heart of his being, in his own biology, is a gay gene which locks the direction of his sexual orientation forever towards homosexuality. Insightful journalists will note, however, that no scientific reference is ever provided by the lobby to support this claim, and for good reason. The twin studies of King and MacDonald, the recent scientific research of Diamond Saving Williams, Bailey and Lohman, as well as the American Psychological Association completely reject this theory of the last century and confirm what many know just by looking around. Human sexuality can fluctuate over the course of a person's life, can migrate, for example, from heterosexuality, which is at one end of the spectrum, towards bisexuality or towards homosexuality, which is at the other end, and vice versa, without even having had recourse to therapy. This is the concept of natural sexual fluidity.
Sexuality is very fluid. In the course of a person's lifetime, they can swing back and forth between homosexual, heterosexual, back again. We know that the adolescents can be more engaged in homosexual activity and then move on, and others in midlife will become homosexual. So there's a fluidity in sexuality.
In regards to sexual attraction fluidity, there is a lot of research that's been done over the past few decades. Lisa Diamond is the spearhead for most of that research. And she started off just looking at women and then expanded it to men to see what happens with people's sexual attraction fluidity over a lifetime.
They consider her a leading expert in sexual orientation change through life experience. Diamond followed 79 non-heterosexual women over 10 years and found social influences on same-sex sexuality. She said the most surprising finding was that bisexual and unlabeled women pursued progressively more sexual contact with men than did women over the 10 years of the study. Two bisexual women with the exact same degree of same-sex attraction in 1995 often made very different choices 10 years later. Whereas one would have settled with a woman, the other would have ended up with a man. It was the case even for women who had started out strongly attracted to women, that they could end up finding themselves fantasizing less often about women and seeking out fewer opportunities to date female partners and become happily married to a man.
And so in that season of my life is when I was evangelized by a group of, it's a really bizarre situation. It was a group of Baptist women, and I found myself on a Southern Baptist softball team. So don't ask me what a lesbian was doing playing softball with Baptists. It was really my love of sports that got me there, but it was absolutely a divine conspiracy. Okay. And so that's what got me around a group of Christians on a regular basis. And there were some that knew, because I looked the part. I was still very masculine. I was still being called Sir, Son, Young Man. I was the runner-up to the Miss Butch America pageant. You guys are like, is there really one? So, poor thing, I scared the poor lady. Anyway, that is some humor to lighten this, some levity, yes.
I will say that I went to 4 different counselors from that point forward, none of which were very productive or helpful to me. Now, the first therapist I went to was a very, what's the right word? He was very popular in the religious community I was a part of at the time. And so everybody sent their kids to this counselor. So what he did really was try and have me read the scriptures a lot and pray and, give me a lot of spiritual stories. So I don't think, in that regard, maybe that was helpful because, it kept my faith going a bit. But it did absolutely nothing. In fact, my attractions were just getting stronger all the time. It wasn't helping that. So that was discouraging. I found out years later, here's an interesting tidbit. I went to him when I was becoming a counselor to get some advice from him. And he pulled out a whole file of information he had from Exodus and Evergreen and said, they sent me this stuff when you were a kid, but I never really believed it, and I never wanted to approach it with you. I wanted to get up and wring his neck. It would have been life-changing for me.
Many therapists say, oh, no, you can't go on that direction. You cannot explore your sexual attraction fluidity because that just can't be done. You'll be harmed. So if you're asking for help with that and they're saying, nope, I'm not going to do it, you can't do that, you have to go my way and embrace your sexual attraction as your primary core identity. And I know that's an exaggeration perhaps. I don't know if people say that, but that's basically the message that I received from some of my clients that came to me that they had heard from previous therapists. It's like there was no hope. There was no hope, and so their well-being actually plummeted, and some of them had actually, for the first time, experienced some suicidality as a result of the lack of support for their autonomy and self-determination.
They didn't really know what to do with me, to be honest, and I didn't realize that their dilemma. But and the main dilemma was this was a church team, and I didn't actually know the difference between sports and church sports. And so, like, I only know sports, and the goal is to win. That's the only goal. And in church sports, it's like, if we win, glory to God. If we lose, glory to God. And I was like, no, I'm not cool with that. And so I was the one in the outfield throwing my glove and swearing when the ball got past the shortstop. So the Baptist women are like horrified because, you know, on my jersey it says, say yes to Jesus. And I'm calling out obscenities. And so they complained to my coach, as you do. We call it prayer request. Y'all know what I'm talking about. As long as your head is bowed when you say it, it's not gossip, okay? And so they complained, and he said, because they were like, Coach, she's cussing the outfield. He said, you see that girl? You pray for that girl. So they did. They were praying for me. And this went on for like a year and a half.
And the other counselors didn't have any information. They didn't know. And the fourth one was just politically incorrect enough to be willing to read Jeff Conrad's book and say, yeah, let's read it together. Let's talk about it. See what applies to you.
John works with different therapists who waste both his time and money because he does not experience any reduction in his homosexual attractions. On the contrary, they are increasing. Are the therapists he consults charlatans? John describes his sessions with them in terms of Bible readings, prayer, and the analysis of spiritual texts. It is difficult to assimilate these elements to anything other than spiritual accompaniment. However, spiritual accompaniment is not therapy. His therapist may have had good intention, but obviously they had never received training on how to support this type of client. They were therefore incompetent. It must be said that at that time, no academic or professional institution offered such training to therapists. Rather, they had to train by themselves, either by consulting a colleague or by studying successful documented clinical cases.
It may be useful here to draw an analogy with weight loss programs. In the post-war years, in a context of newly found food abundance, America saw the birth of fast food, along with an unexpected and phenomenal rise in the rate of obesity. At that time, no courses in nutrition or specialization in dietetics existed in universities. The phenomenon was too new and had not been studied properly. When obese people knocked on their doctor's door for help, most doctors were equipped only with goodwill and assumptions. They then often propose inadequate, ineffective, dangerous, and sometimes even inhuman weight loss programs. Fortunately, years of research with this clientele have led to the development of proven, effective, safe weight loss programs that are now taught in many universities.
What would have happened if instead of promoting research, legislators had banned weight loss programs only because some charlatans used them to take advantage of vulnerable obese people whose health is put in danger? It is clear that the right solution was not to ban the programs or to endanger the health of people or to destroy the reputation of doctors, but to scientifically assess the effectiveness of different diets in order to identify the most effective, to force the doctors wanting to help this clientele to be trained, then to multiply the places where one can receive this training. Banning weight loss programs while merely helping obese people accept themselves as they are would have completely missed the target. The same logic should apply to migration therapy.
The nebulous period of behavioral and aversion therapies, which raise ethical questions, and psychoanalysis, which require an excessive number of years, ends at the close of the 70s. The 80s and 90s saw the appearance of a new range of therapeutic methods stemming from advances in neurology, some of which apply to people wishing to migrate toward heterosexuality, have the advantage of significantly increasing the success rate of therapies while decreasing the duration of treatment. This is the time when the first therapist clinics dedicated exclusively to homosexual people appeared. Meanwhile, the gay lobby was gradually infiltrating the media, mental health institutions, government, and elsewhere, working hard to convince one and all that homosexuality is innate and should not be treated. Seeing the therapies gaining in efficiency and spreading in the West, the gay lobby engaged itself in a race against the clock to have medical and psychological associations ban them. The goal is to discredit any therapist who practices migration therapies, cut funding for research, and make sure that no public institution will ever teach migration therapy before it's too late.
Gay activists have done many studies of opinion, public opinion, the formation and the creation and the manipulation of public opinion. And they have found repeatedly that if you can convince the population, the general population, that homosexuals are choosing that, then there is less empathy, less sympathy for this population. But if you can convince the general population that these people are gay because they have no choice, because there is a gay gene, then there's a tendency to be more tolerant and more accepting. So this notion of the gay gene has to be promoted, the biological origins that are beyond the individual's choice. But there's much more evidence showing that people can change.
But the fourth counselor I went to, thank goodness, had a couple books. And he suggested I go to a conference by Exodus. Went to the conference, and I listened to Jeff Conrad. And it was so frustrating for me at that conference hearing his story and listening to people in the audience heckle him. Because I'd hear his story and I'd think, oh, that's me. Oh, yeah, I can relate to that. Oh, I can relate to that. And then somebody would make a stupid comment. I'm sure he was frustrated. There were a lot of picketers. Well, at least that's my memory. There were a lot of picketers at that one. And he went out into the hall, and I went out into the hall, and I was so lost. And I remember him, he looked discouraged. And I went over and looked at him, and I couldn't get anything out. And I just started to cry. And he came over and he just hugged me. And he said, it's okay. He says, there's answers. You can do this. You can get over this. The feelings can change. They can go away. But you got a lot of wounds and you got a lot of needs. You have to learn how to take care of those. That was the beginning of my recovery.
And so I became a Christian, and it's not like God waved a magic wand over me in the immortal words of Cy Rogers and said, 1, 2, 3, now you're free, go be straight, date and mate. That's not what happened when I became a Christian. My eternal destiny changed, and then now I was faced with a dilemma. I was incongruent now with my faith, and incongruent living is not sustainable. So I had a conflict. How do I not be gay anymore?
1990, started working on my needs, healing some of the wounds. I started to gain a picture of what my deficits were, my needs were. Man, I needed mentors. I needed buddies. I needed to feel masculine. I needed to stop hating my body. So I started engaging goals, working on some things, and went to college, lived with roommates, fantastic experience. Started bonding in ways I hadn't bonded before. I had this great roommate that he'd take me, I remember telling him, I don't know how to play football, and you want to go to the football games. I don't even know what they're doing. I don't know what they're talking about. It's stupid. I don't even like the game. He says, let's go play. And so he took me down to the field, at night, and we tackled a goalpost and some other ridiculous activities. But being with him, having him want to help me and teaching me the game was very healing for me. I don't know that the tackle portion was, but the learning portion was. I remember coming home at night. I was working late at a gas station because I was trying to learn how to do some mechanical things, and I'd be plastered on the bed. I was so tired, and I'd wake up in the morning, and there were nights where he had helped me take off my greasy shirt and get into bed and kind of tuck me in. I'd never had that sort of affection from a buddy before. I remember a roommate that was leaving for Christmas break, and he just hugged me. That's the first time I'd ever been hugged by a guy before. And he says, "Man, I love you." And I remember sobbing. I hadn't heard that before. All these needs and deficits, which I could see later, I'd been sexualizing. I was so hungry for those kinds of things that I'd been sexualizing legitimate emotional needs and wounds.
So it was a process. Thankfully, I heard about ministries that help people like myself. I heard a guy named Cy Rogers on the radio shortly after I became a Christian, and he's got a phenomenal testimony. And so I was very encouraged by that and hope, filled with hope from that. And so I started my journey out of homosexuality. I began to attend a support group in my hometown of Tampa, Florida. And in fact, a gentleman here was in group with me 24 years ago. Woohoo! It's called Straight Ahead, and pun intended. And so that is where I started to understand the roots of my homosexuality, which I've already shared with you in story form. Having a breakdown in the relationship with the same-sex parent, having been sexually abused, gender confusion, all of that contributed to the perfect storm in my life to point me down a road. Now where I chose homosexuality, because I didn't choose the feelings and the attractions, I chose to act on them. But feeling homosexually oriented, I also felt like I had no choice.
Worked on healing my needs. As time went on, it was not a fast fix, and that's something important to know. For me, it took me some time. It took me a few years. But the feelings would diminish. You know, and I would notice as I would go out with guys, I wasn't sexually attracted. The more I got the needs met, those attractions were going down. I didn't have to focus on girls. I didn't have to focus on dating. I didn't have to force myself to think about having sex with somebody or with a girl. I just had to focus on healing the emotional needs. And as I did that, the sexual side of it just would diminish. It would go down. When I'd get hugged on by guys, or my roommates helping me learn football, the feelings are diminishing.
Look, reparative therapy is not just simply a focus on diminishing same-sex attraction. That is the accusation of reparative therapy. Gays and other people who don't know what reparative therapy is think that the client comes in and we hit them over the head with a bat until they give up their homosexuality and then they're cured. No, it doesn't work that way at all, okay? We deal with past trauma. We deal with male friendships. We deal with body image. We deal with assertion. We deal with facing the reality of the fact that you did not get what you needed from your childhood, whether it be mother, father, family dynamic, or whatever. We deal with identity. We deal with self-esteem. We deal with your sense of yourself in relationship to others. You're not a little boy among women. You're not a little boy among men. You're a man among men. So there's a complete transformation of identity.
And then the church is where I built healthy same-sex friendships, which was a monumental challenge. And you can talk to any person coming out of homosexuality, and that is a monumental challenge. Because so often we feel inferior or inadequate in our gender.
The biggest epiphany for me was to realize that my same-sex attraction didn't define me. It was just a symptom of all these other emotional needs, legitimate needs.
And see, what I needed was non-sexual intimacy. So for me to be isolated, I wasn't going to get intimacy. You can't get intimacy if you're isolated. And so I needed to press through my fear of rejection. And so as I got to know people, and not everybody, but on an individual basis, I got to share what I was dealing with, and I felt supported and loved, and that just helped encourage me. And so I was developing healthy same-sex friendships, and I will tell you that as I did this, my sexual attractions for women naturally diminished. Because I got what I was looking for all along: love, intimacy, connection.
I learned over time that I had to immediately start acknowledging. Whenever I was attracted to a guy, I had to acknowledge, okay, I'm having a same-sex attraction, and there's a message underneath it. I had to acknowledge that. When I got good at that, then I would move to the I, which is identify. Now I need to identify what is the message. What is that message? And I got good at that after a while too. You know, if I see this very attractive guy, he's very cut, and I immediately was able to identify there's a message in there. I don't feel like I'm as good as him. I'm very jealous of that. I don't have the muscles he has. Or I'm getting attracted to these guys who are all bantering together and hugging on each other down the hall at school. And I'm realizing I'm missing that. I need that. So when I identified the need, that took me to M, which was move. I had to move into the message. I had to do something. I had to get out there. If I was jealous because of him, I had to go work out. Like the way I look, I had to get into that. You can tell I'm, at this point, very buff, and I got, to liking the way I looked. Or I had to move into buddies. If I was lonely, I had to get into some buddies and move towards the message that was.
Despite all the obstacles that John encounters on his way, the predictions of the gay lobby that he will never be freed from his homosexual attractions, the therapist without the adequate training to accompany him, the protester at the Jeff Conrad conference trying to dissuade him from his quest, John will finally find a competent person who will help him put his finger on what is happening to him, resolve the trauma of his childhood, and equip him with the tools necessary to continue his journey without a therapist. Should John be considered an exception to the rule? That is it as difficult to be freed from your same-sex attraction as it is to win the lottery?
There's over a century of research published including by American Psychological Association members in the peer-reviewed journals of the American Psychological Association. It shows that when therapy is done right, it is effective.
If you take all the studies, the Spitzer study, you take the the Jones and Yarhouse study, you take the studies that are historical, they simply arrive at one conclusion. This is the conclusion that homosexuality is not invariably fixed in all people, that some people can and do change.
Robert Spitzer did a study of about 200 individuals who came out of homosexuality and made a heterosexual adjustment. Robert Spitzer formulated the study, he interviewed the people, and he had a great deal of opposition in trying to publish his data. Now, what's significant about Robert Spitzer is that he was the man who made the 1973 decision. He was ahead of the nomenclature. The nomenclature is the book of diagnostic categories. He was the one who determined whether or not something was considered a disorder or not a disorder. So it was Robert Spitzer who said in 1973, let's not consider homosexuality a disorder. And while he does not consider it a disorder, he still believes that people can change.
Spitzer was approached in the late 1990s because there was the move then within psychiatry as well. The American Psychiatric Association was being lobbied to ban therapy. Spitzer essentially said, I'm not political, I'm a research scientist and so on. We had some sort of ideas some years ago. If they should be changed, I'm willing to explore it. And he did what seems to be a very solid research study in which essentially he concluded that the results indeed were pretty good. A lot of people who had identified themselves as homosexual had become comfortably heterosexual after psychotherapy treatment.
There was not simply behavior or simply attraction, but in core features of homosexuality. Now, this was not a study to determine how many people could change, but whether or not it was correct the statement from the national organizations that no one could change. And he determined that that was not correct.
He could be hardly accused of being a slacker as a researcher, right? And he wasn't coming at it from he didn't have a religious axe to grind, so to speak, on this. And he was just a curious scientist.
This report that it came from a man like Robert Spitzer was very, very significant, very threatening to the gay activists, because until then, Robert Spitzer was their great hero, and they consider him now a traitor.
Dr. Drescher, who's one of the leading anti-therapy activists in the States. He is the editor of a journal called the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Psychotherapy, and he devoted a whole issue to trying to trash Spitzer's results, which I think I read a couple of the articles. I didn't read them all, but they didn't seem to me to have any scientific validity whatsoever. They were really mostly name-calling.
Dr. Spitzer was criticized for his study, and all the studies are somewhat imperfect. But Dr. Hirschberger reanalyzed the research, which was reported in the archives of sexual behavior, and he did something that's called a Gutman analysis, where he reanalyzed Dr. Spitzer's study. And his conclusion was that the study did indeed demonstrate that some people can and do change. When you evaluate studies and to determine, which study is correct among these sorts of studies, number one, you need to look at the study itself, the methodology. But you also need to look at the reputation of the scientist who's doing the study. I can tell you there is not a researcher that has more credibility than Dr. Robert Spitzer or Dr. Scott Hirschberger. They're immaculate researchers. And their conclusion is that some people can and do change.
And things sort of quietened down for a number of years. And then about, a year or two ago or so, a young Californian went very vocal and very public, claiming that he had been harmed by a treatment, and he confronted Spitzer evidently directly. He went to see Spitzer, who is now a man in his 80s and evidently not very well, and somewhere or other he convinced Spitzer that he had been harmed, and he got some sort of apology out of Spitzer.
In the days following the publication of his study, Dr. Robert Spitzer will bitterly experience the thought control that the gay lobby exercises on any individual or organization that opposes its ideological indoctrination program. Radically militant gay colleagues will attack his reputation in psychiatry journals. Gay journalists will write articles to discredit him. Gay activists will call him to criticize him and send him hundreds of hateful emails during the rest of his life to make him pay for daring to question the official party line. If you don't think like me, then you're my enemy. It is the modus operandi of the gay lobby, which takes care to put out of commission any adversary, or put another way, to kill any messenger who announces anything else than the official party line. Doesn't that remind you of some countries where human rights are violated?
It is difficult to see the current tyranny of the gay lobby towards its opponents without comparing it with the message of 50 years ago, when it asked the authorities and the wider population to stop persecuting its members simply because they were different, to show openness and tolerance towards the diversity of sexual orientations, and to create a climate conducive to listening and mutual respect. The one who was once the victim has clearly become the aggressor when we see the misery that the lobby brings to the life of anyone who dares to disseminate what science says about therapies. At the end of his life, after being constantly harassed in this way for 9 years, having become severely diminished by Parkinson's disease and by his advanced age, Spitzer will end up caving in, as Galileo had done 380 years before him. He apologized to homosexuals for having published research that tells lies, raising the possibility that the 200 participants he interviewed himself all lied to him. He died a few months later without the archives of sexual behavior agreeing to retract his study.
You know the story. He was under such pressure that I think he eventually wanted to reinterpret his study. And there's a lot of reasons for that, I think, going on, but that was towards the end of his life. His big reversal was that, well, we can't be sure because this was self-report. Well, and it's interesting about that, if that's the criteria, that if it's self-report research and you have to question it, then, I don't know, 90% of psychological research has to be questioned and thrown out, right? If you can't take people's responses at some level of face value, if everybody's lying to you, then you have to throw a lot of the research out across the board of psychology.
Spitzer had a major impact on the scientific community, even though his methodology did not make it a very high standard study. That of Stanton Jones and Mark Yarhouse, which followed, corrects this lacuna.
What is said over and over and over again is that there's no valid scientific research. Now, I think that that's wrong. There is scientific research, but it's not great, rigorous scientific research. And the people who are the critics, they keep coming back time and time again that there's not a study that's longitudinal, there's not a study that's prospective. Those are the two most important variables. Well, now there is.
If you're looking to see whether an intervention makes a difference, if it's actually can be imply causality, you need a prospective study.
Some people assume that I must be driven by hatred of gay people, or that I've got someone in my family that I'm worried about. It's nothing like that. My interest was largely academic, intellectual. I knew some of the previous scientific literature that was out of the psychoanalytic tradition and other therapeutic traditions where there were studies that were reporting people had changed, and it struck me as very odd that these studies were just being dismissed on the basis of one or two people coming forward and saying, well, I was in that study and I didn't really change.
There is really a rich psychoanalytic tradition of understanding the cause and treatment of homosexuality, but that whole body of literature from the 1920s all the way up to about the 1970s have been buried politically. But when I go back to the early literature, I see that they see what we see today.
It struck me that we wouldn't act that way for a study of alcoholism. If you did a study and reported that a third of the people were sober, and then somebody came forward and said, well, I was one of those people and I wasn't really sober, we wouldn't throw out the whole study on that basis. But that's precisely what was happening in this area. I actually put together a grant proposal, and I sought funding from a number of foundations and met with complete failure in getting the grant funded. Non-religious foundations, no one would touch it. They said, yes, you're right, this is an interesting subject, and it's too controversial and we won't touch it. And it was almost 6 or 7 years after that I got a call from the director of Exodus.
About 400,000 people contact our organization every single year, and what we identify in those who call is there are some very common themes. One of them is sexual abuse. 85% of the men and women who contact us for help would say that they have a history of sexual abuse prior to the age of 12.
And I thought about it, and I realized that the study would be considered as less valid if it was funded by Exodus, in the same way that cancer research funded by the tobacco companies. So realizing that, I said to the Exodus people, we will agree to accept the money for this study from you on one primary condition, that is that you've got to understand, we're not doing this to make Exodus look good. We're doing this because we want to ask the important scientific question whether there's anything real happening here or not. And if it turns out that lots of your people are getting better, you can be happy about that and we'll publish it. But if it turns out that if everybody runs away from this and nobody gets better, we're going to report that too. And they kind of gulped and said, okay.
But it wasn't looking at therapy per se. I was looking at more religiously mediated kinds of change, but it did suggest that change does occur.
Well, in 2011, just this year, last month in October, they published in the Journal of Sex and Marital Therapy, they published their follow-up results to that 3-year study. So now it's been 7 years, and they went back and looked at these guys again and found that these people, these participants, are maintaining their success 7 years later.
The Jones in Your House study, as well as that of Spitzer, add to a long list of research and case studies carried out over 125 years, which considered as a whole converge on an unavoidable conclusion. It is indeed possible to migrate from homosexuality to heterosexuality. However, this overall picture directly thwarts the effort of the gay lobby to convince that homosexuality is innate and unalterable. If nothing is done, the lobby fears that therapies will gain in popularity and that the battle to have homosexuality accepted as a human right will be lost. The American Psychological Association, which now has an LGBT wing dubbed Division 44, reacts by quickly forming a task force which is given the formal mandate to evaluate the effectiveness of migration therapy. The composition of the committee is entrusted to a psychologist, Dr. Judith Glassgold. Quickly, Doctors Stanton Jones, Mark Yarhouse, Joseph Nicolosi, and Dean Bird, who are experts in the development of these therapies and researchers who have studied their effectiveness, are nominated to enrich the task force with their expertise. When the members are revealed, all of these are excluded without exception.
The task force will be composed of Judith Glassgold, psychologist and chair of the task force, board member of the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Psychotherapy, and past president of APA's Gay and Lesbian Division 44. Jack Drescher, a well-known gay-identified psychiatrist, editorial board member of the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Psychotherapy, and a vocal opponent of reparative therapy. Ailey Beckstead, psychologist who counsels LGBT-oriented clients. Beverly Green, founding co-editor of the APA Division 44 series, Psychological Perspectives on Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Issues. Robin Lynn Miller, from 1990 to 1995, she worked for the Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York City and has written for gay publications. Roger L. Worthington was awarded the 2001 Catalyst Award from the LGBT Resource Center, University of Missouri, Columbia, for speaking up and out and often regarding LGBT issues. Finally, Clinton L. Anderson, a gay psychologist and officer of the APA's Office of Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual Concerns, served as Task Force Committee Liaison.
The task force that did the research, the task force that did the gathering of this data was a task force composed of gay activists. Not only were they gay, but they were gay activists in almost all cases.
Of course, these procedures lead to a biased response. And position statements of the American Psychological Association do not represent a consensus of all professional therapists and researchers. They represent a consensus of those who share one particular worldview.
The problem is that people think that the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, these are scientific organizations, and if it has 12,000 members, we imagine these are 12,000 scientists who are addressing these important questions. In fact, these are political organizations, and many of their decisions are based not just upon science, but also dependent upon special interest groups, political factors, economic forces, public relations. There are a lot of factors that go on. Special interest groups within these organizations have a lot of political power.
The decisions and review of research and position statements of the American Psychological Association are written by its Division 44, LGBT division, which automatically excludes people who actually are experts in doing the therapy and doing research on it. It automatically narrows what point of view will be taken.
Confirmation bias is that, you, because of your values or whatever, you are going to be more skeptical of research that isn't consistent with your beliefs and less critical of research that fits with your beliefs, right? And again, that's why there's such a need for diversity of thought and diversity of perspective in this field and in psychology in general, and it's terribly lacking.
When we expressed concerns about that at that time, the president of the APA said, well, you know, we can't have someone who doesn't share our worldview. He acknowledged it was based on a worldview that does not represent all members of the American Psychological Association.
I don't know, that seems to me the claim that, oh, you're a religious organization, therefore we can dismiss you, that seems very condescending to me. You know, science is science, whether you're a faith-based person or not.
Especially in the mainstream and liberal academia, I think it's very hostile to people of faith. I think they're discredited because of their faith, and they're often seen as unscientific. When you get to know people in our community of therapists and those who work in this field of research and science, our values, they inform the way that we practice and the way that we work with our clients. But you know, we're not doing religious work. You know, we're doing work that we think is inspired by our faith values, but it's scientific. It's mainstream psychological practice. The methods that we use for trauma therapy and other forms of therapy like EMDR and CBT and emotional focused therapy and psychodynamic, these are all mainstream therapeutic techniques used by any other practitioner. It just so happens that our clients have different goals.
The American Psychological Association prides itself on diversity, but when it comes to conservative versus liberal diversity, there is none in the leadership of the American Psychological Association. There's none.
In 1979, Michael McDonald and the Doobie Brothers had their hit single What a Fool Believes rocket to #1 on the charts. The song is well known for its catchy refrain, "What a fool believes, he sees. No wise man has the power to reason away." This reminds us why it is essential that in any process of seeking the truth, specialists adhering to a diversity of empirical visions be represented. Thus, what was to guide the selection of members of the APA committee was not their religious adherence or lack thereof, but rather their adherence to a rigorous scientific approach to the effectiveness of therapies. This was not the case. The task force was made up only of men and women with atheistic beliefs, pro-LGBT, and openly hostile to migration therapies.
The APA deemed it acceptable that expert members should not have their place on a scientific committee because they believed in God, implicitly encouraging the segregation of believers in its membership. The APA task force will quickly disqualify the studies of Spitzer, Jones, and Yarhouse, arguing that they do not meet sufficiently high-quality standards to be considered. This will allow it to conclude when filing their final report that no scientific evidence demonstrates the effectiveness of the therapies. But this tactic does not go far enough. The lobby fears that if it stops there, the practice of therapies will continue, and eventually other studies with more advanced methodology will end up proving their success, as was the case for weight loss programs. They must therefore find a way to demonize the practice for good, to arouse opposition from the wider population against them. One way to do this would be to state that they are not only ineffective, but toxic, that those who experience them, especially children, risk suicide. But there's a problem. No studies have been done on children in therapy. Furthermore, those on adults have not reported more harm than in other areas of practice. Moreover, these reports are merely anecdotal. Finally, these anecdotal cases are linked to aversion therapies, which has not been practiced for at least 30 years. Never mind the fact that these studies critical of migration therapies also do not meet the same standards used to disqualify the studies of Spitzer, Jones, and Yarhouse. The task force will include them in its final report. The best known of these being the study by Shidlow and Schroeder.
Shidlow and Schroeder is the famous study completed in 2002 that the APA has used over and over and over and over and over again to tell us that safety is harmful and that it's not effective. This is an exploratory study that has been used to prove cause. It cannot indicate cause, it can't even indicate relationship or even influence. Shidlow and Schroeder recruited using methods that biased the study from the very beginning.
Initially, there were flyers put out in gay venues and things that just said, hey, we want to document like homophobic therapies, and have you experienced harm? Come to us and talk to us.
They advertised, said, we want to use the results to inform the public about about the often harmful effects of such therapies.
The studies that I think were harmful in that review tended to come from the 60s and 70s, these aversive techniques, these things that aren't done anymore.
So what they found out was what they wanted to find out, not what was reality.
It's when you use that kind of research to say, which isn't no longer really relevant to current modern practices, to say this is harmful. Today's care is harmful as well. Again, I don't think you can generalize the study.
The research shows that the risk for harm is not any different from any other intervention. Very clear in the wonderful longitudinal research done by Jones and Yarhouse.
They never identified this as biasing the results. This wasn't one of their limitations that they discussed in the end.
I tend to think it has a limited value, and all you can really conclude from the study is that, you know, some therapy, some attempts to change could be harmful.
Both the study of Shidlow and Schroeder and that of Robert Spitzer were conducted using the same exploratory methodology. Their respective participants were asked to use their memories to assess the success of their therapy in one case, and the emotional damage suffered in the other. Fine observers will note that if pro-gay activists were quick to attack Spitzer's results, arguing that it was impossible to validate if his participants had lied, they were, however, careful not to mention that the study by Shidlow and Schroeder, having the same limit, could just as easily produce biased results, being also without the means to validate the honesty of its participants.
In August 2009, the task force tabled the conclusions that everyone had seen coming. There is no study of adequate scientific rigor proving that migration therapies work. Some people were negatively affected by them. Approaches that avoid changing sexual orientation should rather be taken. The committee does not cross the line, however, of recommending that therapies be made illegal.
The evidence that they use to support treatment change, treatment success, they discount for different reasons, and yet their own flawed material they submitted without question. So it was a very selective procedure, very biased procedure.
This anti-scientific attitude, combined with the unjust exclusionary tactics that mark the selection of the task force members, will lead many observers on the international scene to stop considering the APA as a benchmark organization. Another consequence being that the organization will see several of its members jumping ship.
People are dropping their membership in APA. APA is shrinking. The income that they used to get from the special assessment is dried up. So the APA is going through some real changes at this point.
Sadly enough, the APA has deviated from science. For example, there's a principle that's called the Leona-Tyler principle. This principle was accepted by the APA and never rescinded. And the principles say that the American Psychological Association would not take a stand on issues for which there was not sufficient evidence and professional experience. That has not been the case.
The presidents in my era abided by the Leona-Tyler principle. All of a sudden, things began to change as things became more political than scientific. The Leona-Tyler principle, which was never withdrawn, disappeared. In fact, you can't even find it in the annals of the APA. If I didn't have it, it wouldn't exist as far as they're concerned.
Many of the resolutions made by the American Psychological Association does not comply with this principle. That is, they make statements and resolutions without the requisite science to support them.
The gay rights movement sort of captured the APA. We developed a group of psychologists that numbered around 200 to 250 that rotated themselves through all the offices of the APA. When a rule was passed that you couldn't serve more than X number of sessions on console or on a certain particular office, they would rotate. They would run for another office and then come back to console. So for years, about 200 to 250 people were running the APA.
We believe that they discredit themselves as a source of accurate scientific information.
And they were a very select, inbred group. They were ultra-liberal, and anything that wasn't ultra-liberal was anathema.
A good source of this information is the former president of the American Psychological Association, Dr. Nicholas Cummings, in his book called Destructive Trends in Mental Health.
The book Destructive Trends in Mental Health, and along with a sequel to it called 11 Blunders That Cripple Psychotherapy in America, is getting a lot of attention, both of them. Not in APA. The response to Destructive Trends in Mental Health, The Well-Intentioned Path to Harm, the first response was that Rhea Farberman, the information officer for the APA, immediately sent an email to all of the journals, and the APA owns 28 journals. Most people don't realize that, but 28 journals. Send an instruction to all of the APA journals that this book was not to be reviewed. It's a nice open response, right?
It is sad because they refuse to acknowledge our writings. It's really amazing. They will not review my books. My latest book was positively reviewed by 2 past presidents of the American Psychological Association. And yet the APA Division of Psychoanalysis refused to even review my book.
From the end of the 1980s, the APA, under the influence of LGBT activists who took over its leadership, will radically transform itself, becoming a very select club of individuals dedicated to promoting its truth, its ideology, and its agenda, the LGBT agenda when it comes to homosexuality. At the same time, outside the organization, the gay lobby continues its crusade in the West, with the complicity of the leaders of the mainstream media who are now sympathetic to it. We are seeing a new type of censorship: jamming.
What is jamming? In military terms, jamming or interfering aims to prevent vital communication from reaching the opponent's camp. Concretely, when one side enters into communication with an ally to transmit information which will be unfavorable to the other side, the latter scrambles this communication by simultaneously transmitting a signal on the same frequency band. In doing so, the entire transmission from the opponent's camp is contaminated by interference. Therefore, the recipient is unable to hear the message. The media that supports pro-gay organizations use a similar strategy. Since there is no controversy around the effectiveness of therapies, but this message is detrimental to the achievement of the LGBT lobby's objectives, they flood the West with contrary information, creating an artificial controversy. They interfere, confusing people, hoping to gain enough time for governments to make therapies illegal before they are taught in universities and spread throughout the world.
From the 1990s, several APA members become aware of the organization's ploy, in addition to undergoing the growing segregation that is applied to those of its members who are believers. No longer recognizing themselves in the APA's ultra-liberal values, they see the need to found a new organization dedicated to the search of excellence. NARTH is born.
NARTH is the National Association for the Research and Therapy of Homosexuality. It's a scientific organization dedicated to upholding the research regarding the issue of homosexuality and defending the rights of clients to seek treatment for unwanted homosexual attractions.
NARTH is a professional scientific organization that provides a response to some of the political stands that the American Psychological Association has taken.
Many of the professional associations are influenced by political correctness and political activism that actually overrides scientific data. And so NARTH was started as an organization that would uphold the research finding and not be motivated by political activism.
Basically in 1992, Ben Kaufman came to me and said, look, rumor has it that in 1993, the gay activists are going to use the 20th anniversary of the 73 decision to totally ban any kind of treatment. He came on the same day that earlier that day, gay activists had come into my office and spray painted homophobe, Nazi, the gay rainbow over the front door, which, by the way, is not good for business, I can tell you, people coming in.
NARTH, before we even held our first scientific meeting in 1993, if you go to the American Psychiatric Association's publication, the Gay and Lesbian Task Force of the American Psychiatric Association, in the meeting, it was a board of directors meeting, stated, and it's in the minutes, it's available to anybody who wants to look at it. We had not even formed an organization enough to have a meeting yet. It was our first organizational days. They said, NARTH must be isolated. That tells it all.
They've done a very good job of isolating us for 20 years, but they haven't killed us. We're still around for 20 years.
NARTH's efforts to inform the world of the scientific facts surrounding therapies will come up against the mainstream media, generally won over to LGBT ideology. The media, therefore, practices ethical disobedience by serving merely as an arm of the gay lobby on this issue. In short, the lobby's jamming is doing its work, replacing scientific facts with ideological propaganda.
Well, it's a pretty well-known fact that the mainstream media is just an extension of the liberal Democratic Party, but it's also an extension of the LGBT agenda. And that's because of the absolute power that the LGBT lobby has in mainstream society nowadays. In key institutions like the media, you could see organizations like Media Matters and GLAAD have very deep pockets, and they influence and lobby all the major networks and cable TV shows. They have LGBT media awards. They have LGBT journalist associations, big organizations dedicated to promoting LGBT causes. And this is very distressing that we have whole media organizations that are not interested in good objective reporting. They're arms of political causes. And they're infiltrating the media and other key institutions like education and psychology simply to push propaganda.
We are hearing more and more about therapists who are being threatened that their licenses will be removed because they are providing this treatment.
If you go against the LGBT agenda in the mainstream media, you will quickly find yourself unemployed. In fact, this has happened to many professionals in different fields throughout the country, especially in education and academia. If you don't wholeheartedly support the LGBT affirming agenda, or if you simply offer an alternative to those who are seeking or distressed by unwanted same-sex attractions or gender identity conflicts, you will be pressured, you will be potentially fired, you will be potentially intimidated for those beliefs. And so what it's produced is really a culture of silence and fear.
This has a domino effect. Several mental health organizations endorsed the conclusions of the task force, whether out of ignorance of the facts, fear of reprisal from the lobby, ideological sympathy with the latter, or simply because their leadership is in the hands of pro-gay activists.
In Quebec, the Order of Psychologists is marching in lockstep with the movement, and in 2012 published a notice informing its members that it would be a breach of ethics to offer migration therapy. The organization takes care to support its official position with abundant extracts from the APA report, citing Shidlow and Schroeder's flawed study, among others, without saying a word about the biased constitution of the committee or the questionable methodology that led to its conclusions. At the same time, gay journalists and their colleagues embark on a witch hunt, producing articles and sensational reports in which they describe the therapies as fake, revealing the names and faces of therapists they denounce as charlatans, the testimony of ex-gays as hate speech, and organizations helping people out of homosexuality as opportunistic and exploitative of vulnerable people. Does this remind you of the treatment formerly reserved for weight loss programs before universities trained better practitioners? No matter the identity of the media outlet, the recipe remains the same. They equate exorcism sessions, laying on of hands, electroshock and torture with migration therapies, no matter how remote from reality such comparisons are, simply to convince the public that therapies do not use any recognized method. And they complete the report with the testimony of a therapy survivor who shares his experience of the after effects that will mark him forever. To top it all off, some of these reports are giving awards and recognition for professionalism. A licensed therapist is never interviewed to publicize the true process of therapy. We never hear the success stories of ex-gay people, even though the web is filled with their testimonies.
There's a specific strategy that these organizations and news outlets use. They introduce certain types of stories at certain types of times. It's very common that they'll release a story about a conversion therapy survivor, quote unquote, in January or February, right before the legislative seasons begin on the state level, and this is where all the laws are being considered. They do this by doing what's called a human interest story. And they take someone that supposedly went through conversion therapy and was purportedly harmed by it, often by means of electroshock and some aversion therapy, and then they don't verify any key details like therapist name or dates or when it happened, and they report it as truth. And there's no counterbalance or no counterpoint.
People who oppose reparative therapy equate it with the shock treatment, and they love to make reference to the shock treatment. Well, there was shock treatment for homosexuals in the early 60s, but during the early 60s, there was this trend of using shock therapy not only for homosexuality, but for everything else. All kinds of psychological problems were dealt with this shock therapy.
A very strategic and effective strategy they've used is to use these stories in mass media. And in my book, I document at least 4, 5, 6 ways, legitimate stories and legitimate ways that they've used the media in producing these fictitious stories on programs like ABC's 2020, on different movies that have recently come out on the big screen. They've done many like mini-series, like CBS had a show called Criminal Minds that did a fictitious story. Even Saturday Night Live did a parody of one of these camps. So the indoctrination factor through the media is quite impressive and widespread.
Media outlets don't want to talk about the science behind the issue. They want to talk about what's politically correct. So to try to share this in media, news, TV, radio, any of that, it's just not going to be talked about because it's, there's a lot of complete inaccurate viewing of it. Some people think if you say change is possible, that will lead to more discrimination. I would say not saying change is possible is much more harmful than saying change is possible. There are better ways to deal with the issue of discrimination than to promote lies.
I've done dozens, if not hundreds, of media interviews over the last 10 years. And time after time, the reporters that are assigned to these stories are themselves LGBT identified, and it certainly colors the way that they cover stories. They don't often disclose the fact that they are LGBT identified. They don't tell you that they belong to LGBT activist organizations within the media that have agendas, and they don't tell you their biases. And I believe that is extremely unethical.
The objective is barely veiled. If the lobby succeeds in arousing enough popular hatred towards therapies and therapists, it will be easier to pass a bill removing the right of men and women, often victims of sexual abuse during their childhood, to benefit from this scientifically sound form of help. Manipulated as it is throughout the process, the wider population ends up willingly playing its part in this charade.
The resolution adopted by the City of Montreal to ban therapies is a good example. One can read the following passage. Whereas the therapies which aim to change the sexual orientation or gender identity of a person are cruel, devoid of any scientific basis, harmful to mental health, and that they infringe upon the fundamental rights of the people who undergo them, especially in the case of minors. If we look more closely at this paragraph, we can see that each of its parts has been the subject of misinformation aimed at replacing scientific facts with ideological propaganda. Let's look at them one by one. Are the therapies really cruel? It is true that at one time, aversion and behavioral therapies used in several areas of practice, including homosexuality, raised serious ethical questions after the fact. But these experimental techniques have not been practiced for decades. They have evolved towards modern methods which are at the same time ethical, effective, and empirically proven. This evolutionary path is also common in the health sciences and sometimes inevitable. A good example is that of slimming diets that we touched on a little earlier. Should the slimming diets on offer today be condemned while they help 4 out of 5 people to reach their goals on the basis that certain methods were cruel 60 years ago? Are the therapies devoid of scientific foundations? The facts gathered in our investigation, summarized in this documentary, demonstrate the opposite. There are 125 years of clinical reports and empirical research showing that when the client is motivated and his therapist is competent, individuals can see their same-sex attractions decrease to the point where they no longer represent an obsession, and see their attraction towards the opposite sex increase to the point of being able to engage in a functional heterosexual relationship. Are therapies harmful to one's mental health? The study by Shidlow and Schroeder, whose methodology contains serious ethical breach and no means to validate the honesty of its participants, reported such damage. But in aversion and behavioral therapies that date back half a century, is it necessary to repeat that these techniques have not been practiced for at least 30 years and that the recent studies of Jones and Yarhouse, Nicolosi and Bird, Sheffer, as well as that of Santero, Whitehead and Ballesteros, have not found any significant emotional damage? Finally, do therapies violate human rights? Communicating to a person the recent scientific facts surrounding the effectiveness and the limits of a therapeutic method allows them to make an informed decision. There is therefore no form of hatred, discrimination, violence, or injustice done to this person. On the other hand, hiding from him the knowledge that he can be freed from his same-sex attractions when he confirms suffering from this state and shows motivation to leave it is an injustice. It is to do him violence. Numerous testimonies from ex-gays confirm that those who were not told about migration therapies, but instead directed to persuasion therapies, where they were forced to embrace their homosexuality against their will, experienced greater distress, had suicidal thoughts, and even tried to end their lives. Offering scientifically validated therapy to people who desperately seek it is not a human rights violation. What really violates human rights is making this therapy illegal, thereby depriving the individual of the opportunity to benefit from it. In philosophical terms, this is called opportunism, manipulating the facts, taking advantage of circumstances, in particular the ignorance of the population in general, in order to advance one's agenda at everyone else's expense. In the 4 segments of this paragraph, the drafters therefore carefully chose their words to manipulate the population of Montreal. They have acted to arouse hatred for therapies, therapists, ex-gays, and organizations that support them so that the city achieves its goal of banning therapies without the public opposing it.
This strategy is not new. It was first tested in the United States. There, from 2012 onwards, draft laws aimed at banning migration therapies were successively tabled in 32 states. Although 11 states rejected the legislation after careful examination of the deficiency of the evidence provided, 20 traditionally liberal states, in many ways similar to Canada, went ahead and banned the therapies following commissions of inquiry of dubious objectivity.
I witnessed a lot of fraud. Unfortunately, there are a lot of, I believe, well-meaning LGBT activists that really believe in their cause, that believe therapy is harmful. But I think that some of those LGBT activists are not emotionally and mentally healthy. And I believe that some of them are actually committing fraud when they tell these stories of therapy, torture, and electric shock, and all kind of aversion types of therapy. There's really no facts to back up those stories. They don't provide dates of when they went to therapy, who the therapist's name was, where they got the therapy. Very key, important details that one would expect could produce if such stories were actually true. And without those facts, it's very hard to take their stories as credible.
After all this censorship surrounding the effectiveness of migration therapies, witch hunts in the media to raise hatred towards therapists and therapies, journalists who campaign for the LGBT ideology but who hide it from the public, biased commissions of inquiry banning therapies in several American states, researchers who can no longer find funding to conduct new studies, or non-religious publishers to publish their work, we can also add censorship from Amazon.
In the middle of 2018, the online retail giant unilaterally removed from its repertoire all of Dr. Joseph Nicolosi's work following a censorship campaign orchestrated by the gay lobby. Unfortunately, this is yet another step that has been taken to prevent therapists seeking training in this practice from obtaining training manuals. Meanwhile, the APA is taking stock of the consequences of its ethical disobedience by witnessing the mass exodus of its members. It then entrusts to Lisa Diamond the task of preparing a new, more rigorous work with the aim of repositioning itself on this question and undoing the damage done to its reputation. The APA Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology was published in 2014 and confirms that it is indeed possible to change one's sexual orientation.
The APA Handbook reviews one of the most rigorous studies of sexual identity change in America that followed sexual identity of young adult participants when most were ages 18 through 24 and again about 6 years later. 43% of non-heterosexual men and 50% of non-heterosexual women had any change after 6 years. 66% of men and 66% of women who had any change changed to exclusively heterosexual. 75% of bisexuals experienced change mostly toward or to heterosexual. 8% of exclusively homosexual men and 26% of lesbians experienced change. 8% of exclusively heterosexual men and 11% of exclusively heterosexual women experienced a change. And the heterosexuals who changed mostly to mostly heterosexual. Heterosexuals are the most stable cross-culturally. Statements in the APA Handbook say that attraction, behavior, and identity, all three, change for adolescents and adults. Research on sexual minorities has long documented that many recall having undergone notable shifts in their patterns of sexual attractions, behaviors, or orientation identities over time. Although change in adolescence and emerging adulthood is understandable, change in adulthood contradicts the prevailing view of consistency in sexual orientation, Rosario and Shrimshaw. Over the course of life, individuals experience the following changes or fluctuations in sexual attractions, behaviors, and romantic partnerships, Mistansky, Cooper, and Green. So we have a lot of reputable, well-respected researchers in same-sex sexuality saying the same thing here in the APA Handbook. Diamond and Roski concluded from their research review, several such studies have now been completed and they unequivocally demonstrate that same-sex and other sex attractions do change over time in some individuals. Across several rigorous studies, among those who changed, 50 to 100% changed to exclusive heterosexuality. Most of mostly heterosexual individuals, along with others, also changed to heterosexual. They concluded that rates of change do not appear to decline as participants get older. The series preface to the APA Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology says that the American Psychological Association gave its imprimatur to the handbook, said that its editors and authors were among its most respected members and declared it authoritative. So there's no question the American Psychological Association considers its APA Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology authoritative.
While the APA repositioned itself in its Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology, the same year, North modernized its name, becoming the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity. While some hope for a reconciliation of the two organizations' positions on therapies, the opposition remains. Indeed, Diamond, who identifies as a member of the LGBT community as a lesbian, refuses to accredit the therapies, insisting that if the subjects she studied have indeed changed sexual orientation, the process by which the change occurred was out of their control, sometimes unsettling them to the point where some would try to resist it. In short, if the fluidity of sexual orientation is a real fact, according to Diamond, it nonetheless escaped the control of the will and therefore the modalities of therapy.
Well, how can someone say sexual fluidity occurs through life experience, except that intense life experience known as therapy? That the minute the person enters the office of a therapist, their fluidity stops and cannot occur, and the minute they leave, it can resume again. It just makes no sense.
It is true that we need more research on this, but it seems to me to kind of defy logic to say that sexual attraction fluidity can occur anywhere naturalistically. The only place it cannot occur is in the therapist's office.
I'm a clinician. I teach at a medical school as well. And I can tell you that from the lives of people that I've worked with over the last 4 decades, that they've made remarkable changes in their lives, and that homosexuality is not something that's fixed in all people.
Diamond and Roski summarized the findings of their research review on same-sex sexuality this way. Arguments based on the immutability or unchangeability of sexual orientation are unscientific. Advocates for sexual minorities have argued that sexual orientation is a fixed, biologically based trait that cannot be chosen or changed. We hope our review of scientific findings and legal rulings regarding immutability will deal these arguments a final and fatal blow.
In 2018 is published the most recent study by Santero, Whitehead and Ballesteros on the efficiency of therapies, but only at the cost of great personal effort after 7 long years because of difficulties in finding a non-religious scientific journal interested in publishing it. This high-quality study produces results similar to those of Jones and Yarhouse. Therapy clients experience real change. There's little damage to mental health and a high number of positive responses. The results show that the participants respond as well to this therapeutic practice as to others which have proven themselves. Again, these results point 180 degrees counter to the conclusions of the APA task force.
However, a few months after its publication, a change of leadership occurs at the Lineker Quarterly, and the new editor-in-chief, no doubt frightened by the potential controversy surrounding the research findings, decides to withdraw the study from the review while depriving their authors the permission to publish it elsewhere. This synthesizes well the obstruction faced by men and women of good faith who invest themselves in the search of the truth surrounding the therapies.
In December 2018, an article in the Journal of Montreal announced that the Minister of Justice of Quebec was preparing to consult pro-gay groups on the advisability of prohibiting migration therapies in the province. We have taken steps to be received by the Minister in order to share the fruits of our journalistic investigation with her. Our attempt to speak to her was answered 2 weeks later by a refusal to receive us. 15 months later, the Canadian Liberal government introduced a bill it presented as the most progressive in the world, aimed at criminalizing both the practice of migration therapy for young people and the organizations that promote it. This is the last event that we will witness before completing this documentary.
Recovery became fun. I wasn't trying to, on purpose, get attracted to girls. It was about finding the buddies and how do I make best friends and how do I never learned how to play baseball. I think I want to try that without having a panic attack. And it became fun. It wasn't it wasn't shock therapy. It wasn't somebody trying to tell me, think more about girls and masturbate about them. It wasn't some crazy thing. It was, be who you are. Let guys love on you. Find how to get those healthy guys in your life. I remember my mom saying, your dad might not ever be able to be what you need him to be. You're gonna need to find some other dads who can love you.
My homosexual attractions diminished in frequency and intensity. As a result of developing healthy same-sex friendships and also counseling, I went to therapy, dealing with sexual abuse issues, because that will affect your ability to love and trust. There's other issues, that homosexuality is just a surface symptom. So it's like we gotta get underneath there and deal with what's going on. How do I feel about my gender? Why do I feel like being a woman is a liability?
It was fun though. You get into it and it's like, I could do this forever. I had another friend and we were doing it and I told him one time, I said, I feel like I'm in puberty again, Get to go out and play ball and get to do all these things I always wanted to do without the shame and the isolation and the loneliness. I felt connected for the first time in my life.
After a few years of therapy, John and Christine have each achieved their goal. Their once obsessive same-sex attraction have diminished to a point where they no longer pose a problem. In addition, therapy has enabled them to acquire effective tools to recognize the circumstances in which they are vulnerable to seeing same-sex attraction reappear and to diffuse them if necessary. While the gay lobby had predicted their complete failure, their approach ended rather in greater well-being than ever in their identity as a man and a woman.
Our investigation leads us to make 17 important observations. There are many people who succeed in migrating from homosexuality to heterosexuality. Far from being an exception, they represent around a third of those who meet a competent therapist. The changes they are experiencing are not momentary, but mostly lasting. Many do not consider themselves homosexuals by birth, but attribute their attractions to sexual abuse of which they were victims as a child. Several therapists do not support them properly, as they have not been properly trained. Consequently, there are a significant number of clients who experience dissatisfaction in therapy. Therapists have not received adequate training because universities refuse to offer it. They refuse to offer it out of ideological sympathy with the gay lobby or for fear of reprisals. They fear reprisals because the gay lobby uses intimidation and smear campaigns against those who practice scientific correctness. Intimidation and smear campaigns are used by the lobby with the blessing of the government. Liberal media act as accomplices, encouraging reporters who misinform the population. That misinformation has succeeded in provoking contempt towards anyone who says that sexual orientation can fluctuate. This breeds an omerta, a culture of fear and silence that hampers Canadians' freedom of expression. This is why founding institutions no longer dare to subsidize research on the effectiveness of therapies. Scientific journals no longer dare to publish the results of studies that contradict LGBT propaganda. Book vendors censor scientific works unfavorable to the lobby. Skilled therapists fall victim to widespread hatred and media mockery, and people sexually abused during their childhood who have a legitimate right to receive this aid are threatened with being deprived of it. From these observations arise 5 recommendations. Like it once happened to weight loss programs, governments and all levels of civil society should encourage scientific research to identify the most effective approaches. They should require therapists wishing to help this clientele to be trained on these modalities. They should multiply the places where this training is given, in particular state universities. They should encourage personal initiatives to publicize these places of training, as well as the identity of therapists who already have the skills to help this clientele. Ex-gays should be included among those minorities protected from all forms of hatred and unfair discrimination.
And so over time, as I did that, was dating my wife. That's another story. We have our ups and downs there. She's very patient. She knew before we got married about the struggle. And as my heterosexual feelings started to grow, not because I was forcing them, they were just coming up. We started to date more intensely and got married. And we just have been married 19 years now. Renewed our vows a year and a half ago, and we have 3 kids. So.
In March 2020, Joseph Nicolosi Jr., also a psychologist, opened an international online training service for therapists willing to learn the basics of reintegrative therapy. By doing so, he pursued his father's legacy started 35 years earlier of training a new generation of therapists with one of the most effective approaches in this area. The results of a new study on therapies is scheduled to appear by 2021. It was conducted by Caroline Pella and Joseph Nicolosi before the latter's death in 2017. The preliminary results are consistent with the conclusions of the large studies that we touched on in this documentary. However, it is to be expected that its authors will have trouble publishing their results in a non-religious journal. Therapy critics will undoubtedly attempt to discredit the results. Regulating bodies will threaten to withdraw their right to practice. Hate mail will be sent from pro-gay activists. And we can also predict that no mass media outlet will mention them in its headlines. These men and women who sacrifice their reputation for helping those struggling with unwanted same-sex attractions will never be awarded the Order of Canada. This honor may be bestowed on individuals in recognition of their exceptional achievements and their remarkable dedication to their community. Their audacity and their passion may embody the motto of the order, but they will never receive the order. Unfortunately, they chose the wrong cause. This gives food for thought. In totalitarian countries, it is permissible to speak on all subjects except to criticize the regime in power. Those who criticize the powers that be risk imprisonment and a range of reprisals on one's person and family. Likewise, here in Canada, we can speak freely on all subjects except those that challenge the LGBT ideological agenda. If someone dares to publicly question the compulsory ideology imposed on the people, their reputation and career will quickly be ruined by the media, with the blessing of our elected officials. Is this thought police which censors the scientific facts surrounding migration therapies and which tarnishes the reputation of men and women who help homosexual people really a sign of progress for our society? Is it rather not a sign that we have made a mistake and that we should hurry to correct it before historians rub our face in it for centuries to come? This is Michel Lizotte. Goodbye.